You remember the smell. Solder and warm plastic and new electronics, all mixed together under buzzing fluorescent lights. You remember the drawers. Hundreds of tiny metal drawers lining the wall, each one holding resistors or capacitors or LEDs in little color-coded bins. You remember the guy in the red vest who actually knew what an ohm was. And you remember the question. Every single time. Can I get your name and phone number? That was RadioShack. At its peak, the chain had more than 7,300 stores across the United States, more locations than McDonald's. 95% of Americans lived within a 30-minute drive of one. The company pulled in nearly $5 billion a year in revenue and employed over 40,000 people. By 2017, there were 70 stores left. The brand that once put a personal computer in American homes before Apple had a single retail location, was sold at auction for $26.2 million. For context, that is less than what it costs to build a single Walgreens. This is not a story about one villain. There's no hedge fund raider, no single catastrophic deal. RadioShack died the way a lot of American institutions die. Slowly, by committee, one bad decision stacked on top of another, until nobody could remember what the company was supposed to be anymore. The name RadioShack originally meant the small wooden cabin on a ship's deck that housed the radio equipment. In 1921, two brothers from Boston, Theodore and Milton Deutschman, borrowed that term for their new mail-order business at 46 Brattle Street. They sold ham radio parts to ship officers and amateur operators. The rent was $50 a month. For 40 years, the company grew slowly. By the early 1960s, RadioShack had 9 stores and a loyal but small customer base. It also had a problem. Reckless credit offers to customers had buried the company in roughly $800,000 of uncollectible debt. RadioShack was functionally bankrupt. Then Charles Tandy showed up. Tandy was a leather goods entrepreneur from Fort Worth, Texas, a man who sold hides and handicraft supplies for a living. He knew nothing about electronics. What he knew was retail. In April 1963, Tandy booked a junior ballroom at the Ritz-Carlton in Boston, gathered about 40 RadioShack employees, and made an announcement. I'm Charles Tandy from Fort Worth, Texas. I now own RadioShack. He'd bought the whole company for $300,000. Price Waterhouse had audited it and found a book value of 0. What Tandy did next was simple and ruthless. He killed the mail-order business. He simplified the inventory. He replaced name-brand products with house brands, Realistic for audio equipment, Archer for antennas, Micronta for test equipment, which meant fatter margins that stayed inside the company. He hired staff who actually understood electronics and required store managers to take an ownership stake in their locations. Within 2 years, he turned RadioShack's $4 million annual loss into a profit. By 1969, there were 530 stores. By the time Tandy died of a heart attack in November 1978, at age 60, there were over 4,600. But Tandy's greatest legacy walked into stores on August 3, 1977. The TRS-80 was a fully assembled personal computer priced at $599. RadioShack's own executives expected to sell maybe 3,000 units per year. They got 10,000 orders in the first month. By the end of that first year, 55,000 machines had shipped. Over its lifetime, the TRS-80 Model 1 sold more than 200,000 units. To put that in perspective, in 1977, Byte magazine coined the term the 1977 Trinity to describe the 3 machines that launched the personal computer revolution: the Apple II, the Commodore PT, and the TRS-80. Of the three, the TRS-80 was the cheapest, the first to reach consumers in volume, and the bestseller. By 1980, Tandy was selling 3 times as many computers as Apple. By 1981, InfoWorld called RadioShack the dominant supplier of small computers. Apple wouldn't open its first retail store until 2001. RadioShack already had thousands of them in every corner of America. They had the distribution. They had the brand trust. They had a 24-year head start. They just didn't keep it. After Tandy's death, his boyhood friend Philip North stepped in as interim leader. North told Fortune magazine, "All I know about electronics is that the funny end of the battery goes into the flashlight first." Eventually, John Roach, a computer-savvy executive who'd caught Tandy's eye, took the helm and pushed the company deeper into personal computing and consumer electronics. Through the 1980s, RadioShack thrived. The CB radio craze of the 70s gave way to cordless phones after the 1982 breakup of Ma Bell. The company launched what many consider one of the first true laptop computers, the Model 100, in 1983. You could walk into any RadioShack and buy a Science Fair 201 electronics kit, a pack of resistors, and a realistic stereo receiver, all in the same trip. The clerks weren't just cashiers. They were hobbyists who could explain how to wire a circuit or tune an antenna. By 1999, RadioShack hit its peak. More than 7,300 U.S. stores, revenue of $4.8 billion, over 40,000 employees. The stock was one of the best performers in the S&P 500. And somewhere in the middle of all that success, the people running the company looked at those walls of tiny component drawers and decided they were a waste of floor space. The pivot started quietly. In the mid-1990s, RadioShack began pushing wireless phone sales. By 1998, the company was calling itself the single largest seller of consumer telecommunications products in the world. The margins on phone contracts looked better than the margins on resistors and soldering irons. Management started trimming the parts walls to make room for carrier displays. It seemed logical at the time. Cell phones were booming. Everyone needed one. But RadioShack wasn't the only store selling them. Best Buy sold phones. Walmart sold phones. AT&T and Verizon were opening their own retail locations. In the cell phone business, RadioShack had no special advantage. In the electronic components business, they had been the only national game in town for decades. They traded a monopoly for a commodity. By 2013, mobile phone sales accounted for 52% of RadioShack's revenue. But here's the number that mattered. The company was losing $200 million a year on its wireless business alone. They'd bet the entire company on a product category where they had no edge, and they were bleeding out. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, something even more destructive was happening. Between 2000 and 2013, RadioShack spent over $3 billion buying back its own stock, while generating just $2.1 billion in total net profit over the same billion in total net profit over the same period. They were pumping out more cash to Wall Street than the business actually earned. By the time they needed money to fund a turnaround, the cupboard was bare. And then there were the CEOs. RadioShack burned through 6 chief executives in 9 years, from 2006 to 2015. Each one arrived with a different strategy. None lasted long enough to see it through. Leonard Roberts had led the company through the wireless pivot and the peak years. When he stepped aside in 2005, his chosen successor was David Edmondson, an 11-year RadioShack veteran credited with creating the slogan, "You've got questions, we've got answers." Edmondson lasted less than a year. In February 2006, the Fort Worth Star-Telegram revealed he had faked his college degrees. His resume claimed a bachelor's in psychology and a diploma in theology from Pacific Coast Baptist Bible College. The school confirmed he'd completed 2 semesters. They had never offered a psychology degree. He resigned in disgrace. His replacement was Claire Bobrowski, a McDonald's executive who'd been at RadioShack for just a few months. She served as acting CEO for 6 months before leaving. She later became CEO of Toys R Us, another company that would end up in bankruptcy. Then came Julian Day, a British turnaround specialist from Kmart. Day's approach was simple. Cut everything. He closed 500 stores, slashed travel and training budgets, sold the corporate headquarters, and liquidated the office plants to eliminate the maintenance cost. A few months after arriving, he fired 400 headquarters employees by email. The message read, "The workforce reduction notification is currently in progress. Unfortunately, your position is one that has been eliminated." It made national headlines. Day never publicly explained or defended the decision. Day's cost-cutting did generate short-term results. RadioShack survived the Great Recession while Circuit City went bankrupt. But he never figured out how to grow revenue. He retired in 2011. His successor, CFO Jim Gooch, lasted 16 months before resigning after a 73% stock price collapse. Another interim CEO followed. Then Joe Magnacca from Walgreens arrived in 2013 with yet another turnaround plan. Magnacca was the one who greenlit the ad. February 2, 2014. Super Bowl 48. A RadioShack clerk answers the phone and turns to his coworker. The 80s called. He says, "They want their store back." Then the 1980s literally show up. Hulk Hogan, Eric Estrada, Dee Snider from Twisted Sister, ALF, Chucky, the California Raisins. They ransack the store, hauling away the old displays and outdated merchandise. When they're done, a sleek, modern RadioShack stands in its place. The ad was widely praised as one of the best of that year's Super Bowl. It was clever and self-deprecating. But Time magazine saw the deeper problem. The fact that you evoke warm, nostalgic feelings is not a plus when you're trying to sell the latest in consumer electronics. RadioShack filed for bankruptcy 11 months later. If you're watching this and shaking your head, you're not alone. If you want more stories like this, about the companies and industries America lost, hit subscribe. We've got plenty more to tell. On February 5, 2015, RadioShack entered Chapter 11. The filing listed $1.2 billion in assets against $1.39 billion in debt. The stock was trading at 24 cents a share. The company had posted 11 consecutive quarterly losses. It was burning through $1.1 million every single day. An affiliate of hedge fund Standard General purchased the brand and roughly 1,743 stores. Sprint moved into more than 1,000 of those locations with a store within a store concept, its signage towering over the RadioShack name. For the few hobbyists still browsing what was left of the component drawers, the message was clear. This isn't your store anymore. The arrangement lasted 2 years. On March 8, 2017, General Wireless filed for Chapter 11 again. About 1,000 of the remaining 1,500 stores were shuttered. When the dust settled, roughly 70 company-owned locations survived, a rounding error of the 7,300 store empire. Creditors later sued Sprint for $500 million, alleging the carrier had mined RadioShack's customer data and opened approximately 200 competing stores near former RadioShack locations. Over the course of both bankruptcies, an estimated 25,000 jobs disappeared. And then came the cruelest irony of all. In 2005, the same year RadioShack's profits began their collapse, a small team of engineers at a design school in Italy created a cheap open-source microcontroller board called Arduino. In 2006, Make Magazine launched the first Maker Faire, a festival for hobbyists and tinkerers. In 2012, the Raspberry Pi Foundation released a $35 single-board computer that became the best-selling British computer of all time. The Maker movement, Arduino, Raspberry Pi, 3D printing, robotics kits, DIY electronics, exploded during the exact years RadioShack was dismantling its parts walls and filling the floor space with Sprint kiosks. A new generation of builders was looking for exactly the components RadioShack had spent decades selling. Resistors, capacitors, soldering irons, breadboards, LEDs. They couldn't find them at RadioShack, so they ordered from SparkFun, a Colorado company founded in 2003, or from Adafruit, founded in New York in 2005. Both grew rapidly during the years RadioShack was walking away from the market it once owned. RadioShack did try to pivot back. Too little, too late. In 2012, they started stocking Arduino boards. In 2013, they partnered with Make Magazine on a co-branded product line. But the company was losing $400 million a year and cycling through CEOs every 12 to 16 months. The Maker effort was a side project inside a building that was on fire. The Onion had seen it coming years earlier. In April 2007, they published a satirical article with the headline, "Even CEO can't figure out how RadioShack's still in business." The piece quoted, fictionally, then CEO Julian Day saying he had no idea how the store stayed open. 8 years later, it didn't. Today, the RadioShack name belongs to a Salvadoran retail company called Unicomer Group. There are a handful of authorized resellers scattered across the country. The website still exists. But the stores, the ones with the drawers and the red vests and the buzzing fluorescent lights, those are gone. RadioShack had every advantage a company could ask for. Thousands of locations in every corner of America. A customer base that trusted them for decades. A head start in personal computing that Apple had to spend 24 years catching up to. A brand name that meant electronics to an entire generation. They spent $3 billion propping up their stock price instead of investing in their future. They chased cell phone commissions while their core customers walked out the door. They handed the keys to 6 different CEOs in 9 years, while 2 startups, SparkFun and Adafruit, quietly built the business RadioShack threw away. The parts drawers are empty now. The fluorescent lights are off. And somewhere, in a garage in Colorado or a basement in Brooklyn, a kid is soldering a circuit board with components ordered online, doing exactly what RadioShack taught a generation of Americans to do, in a store that no longer exists. RadioShack didn't die because people stopped building things. It died because the company forgot that building things was the whole point. If this story hit home, give it a like. It helps more people find these videos. And tell us in the comments, what's your RadioShack memory? The first thing you ever built, the part you couldn't find anywhere else, the clerk who taught you something you still remember. We want to hear it.